The sound of laughter echoed through Lincoln Valley Adult Learning Institute as Maria Santos carefully wrote vocabulary words on the whiteboard, her slight Eastern European accent making each syllable a target for mockery. At 29, she had survived wars, refugee camps, and the brutal journey to rebuild her life in America. But nothing had prepared her for the cruelty she would face from 3 grown men who decided that someone who talked funny had no right to teach them English. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. What Tyler Brennan and his crew didn't know was that the soft-spoken woman they'd been tormenting for weeks had spent the last decade mastering a combat system designed by the Israeli military for close-quarter survival. In less than 2 minutes, these bullies would discover that their biggest mistake wasn't underestimating a teacher with an accent. It was choosing the wrong survivor to corner. Sometimes the quietest voices carry the most devastating power. And today, Maria Santos was about to teach a lesson that would echo through the halls of Lincoln Valley for years to come. Maria Santos had arrived in Springfield, Missouri, on a Greyhound bus with nothing but a worn suitcase and a master's degree in linguistics that American employers seemed reluctant to recognize. The journey from her war-torn homeland of Bosnia had taken 15 years, first as a 12-year-old refugee clutching her grandmother's hand in a crowded camp, then as a determined student working 3 jobs while earning her education in Chicago, and finally as a woman ready to give back to others who struggled with the English language that had once seemed impossible to master. Her apartment near the Lincoln Valley Adult Learning Institute was a modest 1-bedroom in a complex that housed mostly immigrants and working-class families. The walls were decorated with photographs from her journey graduation from community college, receiving her bachelor's degree, the day she became an American citizen. Each image told a story of persistence against overwhelming odds, but none captured the most important part of her transformation. 3 evenings a week, Maria drove 20 minutes across town to Warrior's Edge Combat Academy, a no-frills training facility tucked between a tire shop and a Mexican restaurant. The gym's concrete floors and exposed ceiling pipes created an atmosphere of functional brutality that reminded her of the makeshift training areas she'd first encountered during her college years in Chicago. It was there, at 19, that she met Sergeant First Class James Mitchell, a former Army Special Forces soldier who taught KRAV MAGA to supplement his disability pension. Maria had initially signed up for the women's self-defense class after a close call walking home from her night job at a diner. The instructor had taken one look at her, a small-framed girl with haunted eyes who flinched at sudden movements, and recognized something familiar. He'd seen that particular combination of hypervigilance and determination in soldiers returning from combat zones. When Maria mentioned she was from Bosnia, James understood immediately. She wasn't learning to fight. She was learning to never be helpless again. What began as basic self-defense techniques evolved into something much more comprehensive. Maria possessed natural attributes that made her an exceptional student. Excellent spatial awareness developed from years of navigating dangerous environments, lightning-fast reflexes honed by a childhood where threats could emerge without warning, and most importantly, a psychological framework that allowed her to access controlled aggression when necessary. James had trained hundreds of students over the years, but few possessed Maria's combination of technical precision and mental toughness. By her 3rd year of training, Maria was assisting with beginner classes and competing in regional tournaments. Her slight accent, which some people found charming and others used as an excuse to dismiss her intelligence, became irrelevant the moment she stepped onto the training mats. In that environment, communication happened through movement, timing, and the universal language of mutual respect earned through sweat and dedication. The transition from student to instructor had been gradual. James encouraged Maria to pursue teaching credentials, recognizing that her background as a language learner gave her unique Insights into the challenges adult students faced. Unlike native speakers who took English for granted, Maria understood the frustration of being intelligent but unable to express complex thoughts clearly. She knew how it felt to have people assume you were stupid because you struggled with pronunciation, or how humiliating it could be when classroom discussions moved too quickly to follow. When the position opened at Lincoln Valley Adult Learning Institute, Maria saw it as a perfect opportunity to combine her academic background with her passion for helping marginalized people improve their circumstances. The facility served adults who had fallen through the cracks of traditional education, high school dropouts working toward their GEDs, immigrants preparing for citizenship exams, and individuals seeking basic literacy skills for better employment opportunities. Lincoln Valley occupied a converted warehouse in an industrial section of Springfield, surrounded by auto repair shops and small manufacturing businesses. The building's interior had been divided into classrooms using modular walls that didn't quite reach the ceiling, creating an environment where conversations from neighboring rooms often bled through. The fluorescent lighting was harsh and uneven, casting unflattering shadows that made everyone look tired. Student desks were mismatched cast-offs from other educational institutions, bearing the scratches and graffiti of countless previous occupants. Despite the humble surroundings, Maria threw herself into her work with characteristic determination. She arrived early each morning to review lesson plans and stayed late helping students who struggled with assignments. Her classroom walls featured maps of countries represented by her students, vocabulary charts in multiple languages, and motivational posters with messages like, "Every expert was once a beginner, and mistakes are proof you're trying." Maria's teaching philosophy centered on creating an environment where students felt safe to make errors without judgment. She understood that adult learners often carried shame about their educational gaps and her own experience with language barriers made her particularly sensitive to the emotional aspects of learning. During her first month, she established classroom norms that emphasized respect, patience, and mutual support among students. Most of her students responded positively to her approach. Carlos Mendoza, a construction worker preparing for his citizenship test, appreciated that Maria explained complex grammar concepts in multiple ways until he understood. Jennifer Walsh, a single mother working toward her GED, found Maria's patient. Feedback on writing assignments encouraged her to keep trying despite repeated setbacks. Even the older students like Robert Chun, a factory worker learning English to communicate better with his supervisors, seemed to thrive under Maria's supportive teaching style. However, 3 students presented challenges that went beyond typical classroom management issues. Tyler Brennan, Chase Morrison, and Danny Rodriguez formed a tight-knit group that seemed more interested in disrupting class than learning. Their enrollment in the program appeared to be court-mandated rather than voluntary, creating an atmosphere of resentment that manifested in increasingly disruptive behavior. Tyler, the apparent leader of the group, was a 28-year-old with a reputation for violence that preceded him into Maria's classroom. Standing 6'2" with the kind of muscular build that came from prison workouts rather than gym memberships, he carried himself with the swagger of someone accustomed to getting his way through intimidation. His sandy brown hair was cut in a military style that somehow looked more threatening than professional, and his pale blue eyes seemed to constantly evaluate potential weaknesses in the people around him. Chase Morrison served as Tyler's primary enforcer, a stocky man whose thick neck and scarred knuckles told stories of countless bar fights and street confrontations. At 31, he was the oldest member of the group and carried himself with the casual violence of someone who had never encountered consequences that couldn't be overcome through superior aggression. His dark hair was always greased back in a style that belonged to a different decade, and his constant 5 o'clock shadow gave him a perpetually unkempt appearance that suggested he didn't care about social conventions. Danny Rodriguez completed the trio as its most unpredictable element. 24 years old with nervous energy that manifested in constant fidgeting and inappropriate laughter, he seemed driven by a desperate need to prove himself worthy of his companions' respect. His slight build and baby-faced appearance made him appear younger than his years, but his eagerness to participate in harassment and intimidation revealed a mean streak that ran deeper than his youthful looks suggested. From their first day in Maria's classroom, the three men made it clear they had no intention of participating constructively in the learning process. They arrived late, left early, and spent most class time engaged in whispered conversations that frequently erupted into snickering at inappropriate moments. Their disrespect extended beyond mere inattention. They openly mocked other students' efforts, made crude comments about female classmates, and challenged Maria's authority at every opportunity. The harassment began subtly during Maria's second week at Lincoln Valley. When she wrote assignments on the whiteboard, Tyler would loudly comment on her handwriting, suggesting that someone who couldn't write clearly in English probably shouldn't be teaching it. When she pronounced certain words with her slight Bosnian accent, Chase would repeat them back in an exaggerated mocking tone that made other students uncomfortable. Danny's contribution usually involved inappropriate laughter that disrupted the flow of lessons and made serious discussions impossible. Maria's initial response followed the conflict resolution strategy she'd learned during her teacher training. She attempted to redirect negative behavior through positive reinforcement, addressed disruptions calmly and professionally, and tried to engage the troublesome students by finding ways to make lessons relevant to their interests and goals. When these approaches failed to improve the situation, she escalated to more formal interventions. Individual conferences with each student revealed the depth of their hostility toward the educational process and toward Maria specifically. Tyler made it clear that he viewed the entire program as a waste of time imposed by a legal system that didn't understand real-world problems. He expressed particular resentment toward being taught by someone who wasn't even from here, and suggested that Maria's accent made her unsuitable for teaching English to real Americans. Chase's complaints focused on Maria's teaching methods, which he characterized as too slow and too focused on rules rather than practical communication. He argued that people had been speaking English long before grammar books existed and that immigrants should either learn the language naturally or return to their home countries. His comments carried undertones of xenophobia that made Maria's other students visibly uncomfortable during group discussions. Danny's issues seemed to stem from a combination of learning disabilities and resentment toward authority figures who expected him to demonstrate skills he'd never properly developed. His frequent outbursts and inappropriate responses suggested emotional regulation problems that went beyond simple behavioral choices. But his association with Tyler and Chase seemed to amplify his worst impulses rather than encourage more constructive coping strategies. The administration at Lincoln Valley offered limited support for dealing with disruptive students. Principal Margaret Foster was a career educator nearing retirement who had learned to avoid confrontations that might generate paperwork or complaints from students' families. When Maria reported the escalating harassment, Foster's response emphasized the importance of maintaining enrollment numbers and keeping students engaged, rather than addressing the behavioral issues directly. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The financial realities of running an adult education program meant that losing 3 students would impact the institution's funding and potentially threaten other teachers' jobs. Foster suggested that Maria try to be more understanding of the challenges faced by court-mandated students and perhaps adjust her teaching style to better accommodate their learning preferences. The implicit message was clear: teachers were expected to tolerate disruption rather than enforce standards that might drive away paying students. Other faculty members at Lincoln Valley had developed their own strategies for dealing with difficult students, most of which involved avoiding confrontation and passing problematic individuals through the system as quickly as possible. Janet Morrison, who taught basic mathematics, advised Maria to simply ignore disruptive behavior and focus on students who actually wanted to learn. David Park, the computer literacy instructor, suggested giving Tyler's group easier assignments that would allow them to pass without putting forth much effort. The prevailing attitude among staff seemed to be that adult education served as a dumping ground for people who couldn't succeed in traditional academic environments, and that lowered expectations were simply part of the job. Several teachers mentioned that they'd learned to view their role as providing basic credentialing rather than actual education, since many students were only present to satisfy legal requirements rather than genuine learning goals. Maria found this institutional cynicism deeply troubling. Her own experience as an immigrant and non-traditional student had taught her that adult learners often possessed tremendous motivation and life experience that could be channeled into academic success with the right support and encouragement. She believed that accepting disruptive behavior not only undermined the learning environment for serious students, but also reinforced negative stereotypes about the capabilities of marginalized populations. As weeks passed, the harassment from Tyler's group intensified in both frequency and severity. What had begun as mild mockery of Maria's accent evolved into open challenges to her qualifications and authority. Tyler began arriving at class with printed articles about English grammar rules, which he would wave dismissively while arguing that Maria's explanations were incorrect. Chase started recording parts of her lessons on his phone, claiming he wanted to show friends examples of how not to teach English. Danny's contributions became increasingly crude, with comments about Maria's appearance and suggestions about what she might be willing to do to help male students improve their grades. The psychological impact of sustained harassment was beginning to affect Maria's performance in ways that concerned her deeply. She found herself second-guessing her pronunciation of certain words, editing her natural speech patterns to minimize her accent, and avoiding topics that might provide opportunities for mockery. The confidence she'd built through years of academic achievement and martial arts training seemed to erode a little more each day as the three men systematically attacked the aspects of her identity that had previously been sources of strength. More troubling was the effect their behavior was having on other students in the class. Several immigrants had stopped participating in discussions after witnessing how Tyler's group responded to accented English. Jennifer Walsh mentioned privately that she was considering dropping out because the classroom environment had become too stressful to concentrate effectively. Even native English speakers seemed reluctant to engage with lesson material when they knew their efforts might become targets for ridicule. Maria realized that her response to this situation would define not only her future at Lincoln Valley, but also her understanding of who she had become during her journey from refugee to educator. The coping strategies that had served her well in other challenging environments, patience, persistence, and professional detachment, seemed inadequate for dealing with sustained personal attacks designed to undermine her core identity. 3 months into her tenure at Lincoln Valley, Maria Santos stood at a crossroads that would test everything she had learned about survival, dignity, and the price of standing up to bullies who mistake kindness for weakness. The fluorescent lights in classroom 104 cast harsh shadows across the worn linoleum floor as Maria Santos arranged handouts for her Monday morning lesson on conditional sentences. Outside, the November wind rattled the windows of Lincoln Valley Adult Learning Institute, carrying with it the industrial smell of the nearby metal fabrication plant and the promise of an early winter. She had arrived an hour before class, as was her habit, to mentally prepare for another week of navigating the increasingly hostile dynamic that Tyler Brennan and his companions had created. Maria's weekend had been spent at Warrior's Edge Combat Academy, where Sergeant James Mitchell had introduced advanced scenarios involving multiple attackers in confined spaces. The training session had been particularly intense, focusing on psychological preparation for situations where de-escalation was impossible and immediate decisive action became necessary for survival. James had noticed Maria's distraction during the drills and pulled her aside afterward to discuss whatever was troubling her outside the gym. "You're holding back," he had observed as they sat in his cramped office overlooking the training floor. "Your technique is solid, but there's hesitation in your movements that wasn't there 6 months ago. Something's eating at you." Maria had explained the situation at Lincoln Valley without going into specifics about the harassment she was facing. James listened with the kind of focused attention that came from years of evaluating threats and assessing personnel under pressure. When she finished, his response was characteristically direct. "Bullies are predators," he said simply. "They test boundaries to see what they can get away with. Every time you tolerate behavior that crosses a line, you're teaching them that the line doesn't exist. The question isn't whether this will escalate, it's when and how badly you'll be compromised when it happens." His words echoed in Maria's mind as she reviewed her lesson plan for the week. The curriculum called for practicing workplace communication scenarios, which would require students to role-play professional interactions and demonstrate appropriate language for various business situations. Under normal circumstances, these exercises were among her favorites because they provided practical skills that students could immediately apply to improve their employment prospects. However, the thought of asking Tyler's group to participate in respectful workplace simulations felt almost absurd, given their consistent pattern of disruptive behavior. Over the past month, their harassment had evolved from casual mockery to calculated psychological warfare, designed to undermine her authority and create an atmosphere of chaos that made effective teaching impossible. The previous Friday had been particularly difficult. Tyler had brought a small digital recorder to class, claiming he needed to review lessons for better comprehension. Throughout the session, he had ostentatiously recorded Maria's explanations while making the exaggerated facial expressions whenever her accent became noticeable. When she asked him to put the device away, he responded that students had a right to create study materials, and that she couldn't prevent him from learning in whatever way worked best for him. Chase had supported Tyler's position by arguing loudly that teachers who had problems with students recording lessons probably had something to hide. He suggested that maybe Maria was embarrassed about her pronunciation and didn't want evidence of her mistakes to be reviewed later. The comment had drawn uncomfortable laughter from some other students and visible distress from others who understood the cruelty behind the observation. Danny's contribution had been to start a running commentary on Maria's speech patterns, loudly whispering corrections to her pronunciation and grammar that were often incorrect themselves but delivered with enough confidence to confuse students who weren't sure what to believe. His constant interruptions made it impossible to maintain the flow of instruction and created an environment where other students became reluctant to participate for fear of similar treatment. The cumulative effect of these tactics was devastating to classroom morale and learning outcomes. Students who had been making steady progress in their language development were beginning to regress, second-guessing themselves constantly and avoiding opportunities to practice speaking aloud. The supportive community atmosphere that Maria had worked so hard to create during her first weeks at Lincoln Valley was dissolving into an environment of tension and mutual suspicion. Maria had documented each incident in detailed reports to Principal Foster, hoping that a clear pattern of escalating harassment would prompt administrative intervention. Instead, Foster's responses had become increasingly defensive about the school's inability to address the situation effectively. During their most recent meeting, the principal had suggested that Maria might benefit from additional training in classroom management techniques specifically designed for adult learners with criminal backgrounds. "These men have been through the system," Foster had explained with the weary tone of someone who had given this speech many times before. They're naturally suspicious of authority figures, especially ones they perceive as different from themselves. Your accent, your background. It's not your fault, but it does create additional challenges that you need to learn to navigate. The implicit message was clear. The problem wasn't the student's behavior, but Maria's failure to adapt her identity to accommodate their prejudices. Foster's suggestion that she consider modifying her speech patterns to minimize her accent had been particularly galling, representing exactly the kind of cultural erasure that Maria had spent years learning to resist. The conversation had ended, with Foster's reminder that Lincoln Valley operated on thin financial margins and couldn't afford to lose students over personality conflicts between instructors and learners. The principal's final comment, that perhaps Maria might be happier at an institution with a more traditional student population, felt like a barely veiled threat that her job security depended on tolerating whatever behavior Tyler's group chose to escalate to. That weekend, Maria had considered her options with the kind of systematic analysis that James Mitchell had taught her to apply to tactical situations. Resignation would solve her immediate problem, but would also abandon the students who genuinely wanted to learn and were counting on her support. Requesting a transfer to different classes might be possible, but would likely be viewed as an admission of professional failure and could impact her future opportunities within the educational system. More importantly, walking away would validate Tyler's apparent belief that immigrants with accents didn't belong in positions of authority over real Americans. Maria had encountered this particular form of xenophobia throughout her journey from refugee to educator, and she understood that yielding to it now would reinforce the same prejudices that made life difficult for countless other immigrants trying to build better lives in America. The alternative was to stand her ground and find a way to neutralize the harassment without compromising her professional standards or personal safety. This approach carried significant risks, particularly given the three men's obvious willingness to escalate conflicts and their apparent assumption that a small woman with an accent would be unlikely to resist their intimidation effectively. As students began arriving from Monday morning class, Maria made a conscious decision to implement what James Mitchell called tactical patience, maintaining professional composure, while carefully documenting every boundary violation and preparing for the moment when more decisive action might become necessary. The strategy required walking a fine line between accommodation and appeasement, responding to harassment firmly but proportionally while avoiding actions that could be characterized as aggressive or inappropriate. Tyler arrived 15 minutes late, as had become his pattern, entering the classroom with enough noise and disruption to derail whatever lesson was in progress. He made a show of checking his phone, sighing dramatically about having to be present, and engaging in a loud conversation with Chase about their weekend activities that seemed designed to demonstrate their indifference to the educational environment. "Sorry, I'm late, Teach," Tyler announced without any trace of actual apology. "Had some real-world business to take care of. You know how it is in America, sometimes you got to prioritize actual important stuff over classroom games." The comment contained multiple layers of disrespect: the dismissive nickname, the implication that Maria didn't understand American priorities, and the characterization of education as irrelevant games rather than serious professional development. Other students shifted uncomfortably in their seats, recognizing the provocative nature of the statement, but uncertain how to respond without becoming targets themselves. Maria maintained her composure while making a mental note of the incident for her ongoing documentation. "Tyler, please take your seat so we can begin today's lesson on professional communication. This material will be particularly relevant for job interviews and workplace interactions." Chase laughed loudly from his position near the back of the room. "Professional communication? Like teaching people to talk, right? That's pretty funny. Coming from someone who..." He trailed off with an exaggerated smirk that made his meaning clear without crossing into explicitly verbal harassment. Danny picked up the thread immediately. Yeah, maybe we should practice giving interviews to people who, sound like they're actually from here. Just for realism and stuff. The room fell silent except for the hum of fluorescent lights and the distant sound of machinery from the manufacturing plant next door. Maria felt the familiar tightness in her chest that accompanied moments when her identity as an American was questioned based on her accent, but she pushed past the emotional response to focus on the immediate tactical situation. Danny, Chase. Your comments are inappropriate and disruptive to the learning environment, Maria said calmly. Please open your workbooks to page 47 so we can begin with vocabulary review. Tyler leaned back in his chair with deliberate casualness. You know what, Teach? I think Danny's got a point. If we're going to practice professional communication, shouldn't we be learning from someone who sounds professional? No offense, but when you talk, it's hard to focus on the lesson because we're all trying to figure out what you're actually saying. The attack was more direct than usual, designed to publicly question Maria's qualifications while maintaining plausible deniability about its malicious intent. Other students looked down at their desks, caught between wanting to defend their instructor and fearing retaliation if they spoke up. The silence stretched uncomfortably as Tyler waited for Maria's response, clearly expecting her to either back down or provide him with additional ammunition for further harassment. Maria felt something shift inside her consciousness, a subtle but unmistakable transition from defensive to offensive mindset that she recognized from her most intense training sessions with James Mitchell. Her heart rate remained steady, but her awareness expanded to take in every detail of the classroom environment: exit routes, potential weapons, the positioning of all three men relative to each other and to the other students, who might be caught in the middle of any physical confrontation. Tyler, she said quietly, her accent suddenly seeming less like a vulnerability and more like a badge of honor representing everything she had survived to reach this moment. Your comment reveals more about your limitations than mine. Professional communication isn't about sounding like everyone else. It's about expressing complex ideas clearly and respectfully, regardless of your background. She moved slightly as she spoke, positioning herself where she could see all three men simultaneously while maintaining easy access to the classroom door. The movement was subtle enough to appear natural, but Tyler's expression suggested he had noticed something different about her body language. For example, Maria continued, a truly professional person would recognize that linguistic diversity is an asset in global business environments, and that effective communication skills matter more than regional accent variations. Someone with actual workplace experience would understand that successful companies value employees who can connect with diverse client populations. Chase shifted in his seat, his earlier confidence replaced by uncertainty about where Maria was going with this response. Yeah, well, that's fine for fancy corporate jobs, but most of us are just trying to get regular work with regular people who speak regular English. Define regular English, Chase, Maria replied, her tone remaining perfectly calm while her words carried a subtle challenge. Are you referring to the English spoken in Boston, which sounds nothing like the English spoken in rural Alabama? Or perhaps the professional English used in international business, which often includes speakers from dozens of different countries? Danny laughed nervously, sensing that the conversation had moved into territory where his companions were less comfortable. Come on, you know what he means. He means normal American English, not all that fancy stuff. I understand exactly what he means, Danny, Maria said, her green eyes seeming to look directly through him. The question is whether he understands the implications of his statement, and whether any of you are prepared for the consequences of continuing this particular line of discussion. The three men exchanged glances, suddenly aware that their usual tactics weren't producing the expected results. Tyler had expected Maria to become defensive about her accent or to retreat into administrative protocols about respectful classroom behavior. Instead, she seemed to be inviting them to escalate the confrontation in ways that might not work out to their advantage. For the first time since they had begun their campaign of harassment, Tyler Brennan found himself wondering if he had accurately assessed his target. The small woman standing at the front of the classroom no longer looked like a victim waiting to be intimidated. Her posture was relaxed but alert. Her voice was steady despite the personal nature of the attacks, and something in her eyes suggested that she was evaluating the three men with the kind of cold calculation usually reserved for tactical assessments, rather than classroom management. "Whatever, teach," Tyler muttered, but his voice lacked its usual confidence. "Let's just get on with the lesson." Maria smiled slightly, recognizing the moment when a predator first realizes that their intended prey might be more dangerous than anticipated. "Excellent suggestion, Tyler. Let's begin with role-playing exercises for job interviews. You'll be practicing how to present yourself professionally to employers who value competence over prejudice." As she distributed handouts for the exercise, Maria allowed herself a moment of satisfaction at having handled the confrontation without compromising her professional standards or escalating to physical conflict. However, she also understood that Tyler's group would likely interpret her successful resistance as a challenge that required a more aggressive response. The real test was still coming, and when it arrived, Maria Santos would be ready to demonstrate exactly what kind of professional communication skills she had learned during her decade of survival training. The Tuesday morning air carried the bitter scent of approaching winter as Maria Santos unlocked the doors to Lincoln Valley Adult Learning Institute 45 minutes before her first class. The building's heating system struggled against the dropping temperatures, creating an intermittent clicking sound that echoed through empty hallways lined with motivational posters that seemed increasingly ironic given the deteriorating situation. In her classroom, Maria had spent Monday evening reviewing security footage from the Institute's limited camera system, using her administrative access to study Tyler Brennan's patterns of movement throughout the building. What she discovered was troubling. The three men had been conducting their own reconnaissance, testing door locks, timing security rounds, and mapping areas with limited visibility. Their behavior suggested planning that went far beyond classroom disruption. At Warriors Edge Combat Academy that Monday night, James Mitchell had introduced her to threat assessment protocols developed for high-risk security situations. The training focused on recognizing pre-attack indicators and understanding how predators escalated from psychological intimidation to physical violence. The scenarios were uncomfortably relevant to her current circumstances. When someone maps your environment and tests your responses systematically, James had explained while demonstrating defensive positioning techniques, they're not planning to back down. They're planning to win. The question becomes whether you're going to let them choose the time and place of confrontation, or take control of the situation before they do. Maria's reflection was interrupted by the sound of heavy footsteps in the hallway outside her classroom. Through the small window in her door, she could see Tyler approaching with two men she didn't recognize, older, harder-looking individuals, whose prison tattoos and predatory body language suggested they weren't students. Chase and Danny flanked the group, their usual nervous energy replaced by an anticipatory tension that made Maria's trained instincts immediately alert to danger. Tyler knocked on her classroom door with deliberate slowness, each impact creating a hollow sound that seemed to echo through the empty building. When Maria opened the door, maintaining professional composure despite every tactical warning signal firing in her consciousness, she found herself facing what was clearly an organized intimidation effort designed to overwhelm her defenses through sheer numbers and implied threat of violence. "Morning, Teach," Tyler said with a smile that contained no warmth whatsoever. "Brought some friends to audit your class today. Hope that's not a problem." The two strangers positioned themselves on either side of Tyler, their presence creating a wall of intimidation that blocked most of the hallway. The larger man, who appeared to be in his late 30s with the kind of muscular build that came from years of prison workouts, studied Maria with cold blue eyes that seemed to catalog potential weaknesses. His companion was smaller but somehow more dangerous, with facial scars that told stories of violence and a predatory stillness that suggested coiled aggression barely held in check. "I'm sorry, but auditors need to be pre-approved through the administration office," Maria replied calmly, noting that all 5 men had positioned themselves to block her access to the main hallway, while leaving the emergency exit at the far end of her classroom as her only viable escape route. "You're welcome to speak with Principal Foster about arranging official visits during regular office hours." Tyler's smile widened. "See, that's where you're wrong, Teach. My uncle here." He gestured toward the larger stranger. "He's got legitimate concerns about the quality of education I'm receiving. Family's got a right to make sure their investment in my future is being handled properly." The implication was clear. This wasn't a random escalation, but a calculated expansion of harassment designed to demonstrate that Tyler had access to additional resources if Maria continued to resist his dominance in the classroom. The presence of family members also created a narrative framework where any conflict could be characterized as Maria attacking concerned relatives rather than defending herself against organized intimidation. "And my cousin Rick here," Tyler continued, indicating the scarred man. "He's thinking about enrolling in the program himself. Wants to see what kind of teaching methods we're dealing with before he commits to spending his time and money on education from someone who ... Tyler paused dramatically. ... might not be the best fit for American students with American needs." Maria felt the familiar psychological pressure that came from being outnumbered by individuals whose body language screamed potential violence. However, her years of training with James Mitchell had prepared her for exactly this scenario: multiple attackers in a confined space, using implied threats and social positioning to create fear without crossing legal lines that would justify defensive action. "I understand your concerns," Maria said, maintaining eye contact with Tyler while using her peripheral vision to track the positioning of all 5 men. "However, I'm not comfortable having unofficial visitors in my classroom without proper authorization. Perhaps we could schedule a meeting with Principal Foster, present to address any questions about curriculum or teaching methods." Rick stepped forward slightly, his movement deliberate and threatening without being overtly aggressive. "Maybe the problem is that you're not comfortable with legitimate oversight of your performance. Makes a person wonder what you're trying to hide." Chase laughed from his position near the doorway. "Yeah, like maybe she knows she's not qualified to teach English to real Americans and doesn't want anyone with actual standards evaluating her work." Danny nodded eagerly, his nervous energy manifesting in rapid speech. "Could be she's worried about people finding out that her accent makes it hard for students to learn proper pronunciation. Wouldn't want that getting back to the administration, right?" The coordinated nature of their comments revealed the depth of planning that had gone into this confrontation. Each man had a specific role designed to create psychological pressure, while maintaining plausible deniability about their intentions. Tyler served as the primary spokesperson. His family members provided implicit threat of escalation, and Chase and Danny offered supporting harassment that could be dismissed as legitimate educational concerns. Maria recognized the tactical situation. Immediately, she was being tested to see how she would respond to organized intimidation involving multiple attackers with probable criminal backgrounds. Every response carried risks. Backing down would encourage further escalation. Appealing to authority would reveal the limitations of institutional protection, and direct confrontation could provide justification for the violence these men were clearly prepared to use. "Gentlemen," Maria said quietly, her voice carrying a subtle steel that made Tyler's uncle take a closer look at her positioning and body language. "I appreciate your interest in educational quality. However, my classroom policies are non-negotiable. Official visitors must be pre-approved, and anyone who wishes to observe my teaching methods is welcome to do so through proper administrative channels. She paused, allowing her gaze to move deliberately across each man's face with the kind of assessment she'd learned to use when evaluating opponents before sparring matches. I'm sure you understand that maintaining professional standards benefits everyone involved in the educational process. Tyler's expression darkened as he realized that his expanded intimidation effort wasn't producing the desired results. The presence of family members was supposed to demonstrate escalating consequences for continued resistance, but Maria's refusal to be intimidated suggested either impressive courage or dangerous preparation that he hadn't anticipated. You know. What? Teach? Tyler said, his voice carrying the edge that preceded most of his serious confrontations. I think there's been a misunderstanding about how things work around here. See, my family's got connections in this community. Business relationships, political relationships, the kind of relationships that determine whether places like this get funding or get shut down. The threat was more explicit now, designed to demonstrate that Tyler's reach extended beyond the classroom into areas where Maria's livelihood and professional future could be affected. His uncle nodded approvingly, clearly pleased with this escalation toward more direct intimidation tactics. My nephew's education is important to us, the uncle added, his voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to getting his way. Through implied consequences, we want to make sure he's getting instruction that meets our standards. If there are concerns about teaching quality, those concerns need to be addressed appropriately. Rick shifted his weight in a way that brought him slightly closer to Maria, while maintaining the appearance of casual conversation. Sometimes educational institutions need help understanding what their community actually wants from them. Feedback from concerned families, you might say. Maria felt the familiar calm that James Mitchell had trained her to access in high-stress situations. Her heartbeat remained steady while her awareness expanded to take in every detail of the tactical environment, distances between opponents, potential weapons, escape routes, and the psychological dynamics that were driving this confrontation toward a potentially violent conclusion. I understand your position, Maria said, her accent somehow seeming less like a weakness and more like evidence of the complex journey that had brought her to this moment. However, I think there may be some confusion about mine. She moved slightly as she spoke, positioning herself where she could see all 5 men, while maintaining access to both the classroom door and the emergency exit. The movement was subtle, but purposeful, and Tyler's uncle recognized something in her body language that made him reassess his initial impression of her as an easy target. My position, Maria continued, is that educational standards exist to benefit students, not to accommodate the prejudices of people who mistake ignorance for authenticity. My teaching methods are based on research and experience, not on the comfort level of individuals who view linguistic diversity as threatening rather than valuable. The silence that followed her statement was charged with tension as all 5 men processed the implications of her words. Maria had essentially called them ignorant bigots, while refusing to back down despite being outnumbered 5-1. The response required either escalation or retreat, and Tyler's pride wouldn't allow retreat in front of family members who had come to witness his dominance over the problematic teacher. Careful, Teach, Tyler said quietly, his voice carrying genuine menace for the first time since she'd known him. You're starting to sound like someone who thinks she's too good for the people she's supposed to be serving. That kind of attitude can cause problems for people in your position. Chase and Danny moved closer, sensing that their leader was preparing to cross lines that had previously been implied rather than stated. The uncle and Rick remained slightly back, but their positioning suggested readiness to provide support if the situation escalated to physical confrontation. Maria looked at each man in turn, her green eyes reflecting the kind of cold calculation That made career criminals reconsider their assessment of potential victims. When she spoke, her voice carried absolute certainty about the consequences of continued escalation. Tyler, I want you and your friends to listen very carefully to what I'm about to tell you, she said quietly. I came to this country as a 12-year-old refugee who had already seen more violence than most people encounter in their entire lives. I've spent the last 15 years building a life based on education, hard work, and respect for others, regardless of their background. She paused, allowing the weight of her words to settle before continuing. I didn't survive war, displacement, and years of people questioning my right to be here, just to be intimidated by individuals who think accent differences make them superior to someone with advanced degrees and professional qualifications. Tyler's face flushed red as the implications of her statement hit him. She wasn't just refusing to back down, she was challenging the fundamental assumptions about power and authority that his entire identity was built around. Worse, she was doing it in front of family members whose respect was crucial to his standing in their criminal organization. You think your fancy education makes you better than us? He snarled, taking a step forward that brought him within arm's reach of Maria. You think because you got some college degrees that means you can disrespect American workers who've been contributing to this community their whole lives. Maria smiled slightly, recognizing the moment when psychological intimidation crossed the line into physical threat. Everything that happened next would depend on whether Tyler was smart enough to recognize that he had chosen the wrong target for his demonstration of dominance. No, Tyler, she said calmly. I think my education, experience, and character make me qualified to teach this class. What makes me better than you isn't my background, it's my willingness to build people up instead of tearing them down. The gauntlet had been thrown, and Tyler Brennan's response would determine whether this confrontation ended with words or escalated into the kind of violence that would change everything for everyone involved. The tension in the hallway outside Classroom 104 was thick enough to cut with a knife as Tyler Brennan's face cycled through shades of red that spoke to barely controlled rage. His uncle watched the exchange with the calculating eyes of someone who had witnessed countless confrontations and understood that the small woman in front of them was not responding according to the script they had expected. Rick's scarred features displayed a predatory interest that suggested he was actually hoping for an excuse to demonstrate why his reputation, in certain circles, was built on more than just intimidating appearances. You know what your problem is? Tyler said, his voice dropping to the low growl that had preceded every serious assault in his criminal career. You think because you memorize some textbooks and learn to talk fancy that you understand how the real world works. But out here, degrees don't mean shit when you don't have the backing to make people respect them. Maria remained perfectly still, her training allowing her to project calm confidence while every nerve ending screamed tactical awareness. She could hear the distant sound of janitors working in other parts of the building, but the early morning hour meant that help was far away and likely unaware of what was developing in this isolated section of Lincoln Valley. The positioning of the 5 men had effectively created a kill zone where any physical confrontation would be over before anyone could intervene. Respect isn't something you can force, Tyler, Maria replied quietly, her accent somehow making the words carry more weight rather than less. It's something you earn through your actions and character. Right now, you're demonstrating exactly why people who actually matter don't take you seriously. The insult hit its target with surgical precision. Tyler's entire identity was built around being taken seriously through intimidation, and having a woman with an accent dismiss his importance in front of family members whose respect was crucial to his standing created a psychological crisis that could only be resolved through demonstrating dominance. Chase stepped forward eagerly, sensing his leader's approaching decision to escalate. Let me handle this, Tyler. This immigrant bitch needs to learn some respect for Americans who were born here. The racial slur crossed a line that transformed the confrontation from workplace harassment into something much more dangerous. Maria felt the familiar shift in her consciousness that James Mitchell had trained her to recognize, the moment when de-escalation became impossible and survival required accessing capabilities that most people hoped they would never need to use. "Chase," she said calmly, her voice carrying a new quality that made Tyler's uncle take a step backward despite himself. "You just made a very serious mistake." Danny laughed nervously, misreading the situation completely. "Oh yeah, what are you going to do about it? Report us to the principal? File a complaint with the administration? We already told you how much that's going to help." Maria's smile was barely perceptible, but it carried the kind of confidence that made Rick's predatory instinct suddenly uncertain about whether he was looking at prey or another predator. "No, Danny, I'm going to give you all one final opportunity to walk away with your dignity intact. After that, you're going to discover what happens when you mistake professional courtesy for weakness." Tyler's uncle had been studying Maria's body language with the kind of attention that came from 30 years of evaluating threats in prison environments. Something about her positioning, her breathing, and the subtle changes in her posture triggered warning signals that he couldn't quite identify but had learned to trust implicitly during his years of survival in maximum security facilities. "Tyler," he said quietly, his voice carrying a note of caution that surprised everyone present. "Maybe we should." "Shut up, Uncle Frank," Tyler snapped, his pride overriding whatever concerns the older man was trying to express. "I'm not backing down from some college girl who thinks her fancy accent makes her special. It's time she learned how things really work around here." He reached toward Maria, his large hand moving to grab her shoulder in the same intimidation technique that had worked countless times against teachers, social workers, and other authority figures who had tried to impose consequences for his behavior. The movement was deliberate and threatening, designed to initiate physical contact that would establish his dominance while maintaining plausible deniability about his intentions. Maria moved. The transformation was so sudden and complete that the 5 men barely had time to process what they were seeing. One moment Tyler was reaching for a small woman who appeared defenseless despite her defiant words. The next moment he was bent over at an impossible angle, his right arm trapped in a joint lock that sent lightning bolts of agony through his shoulder while his left hand desperately tried to relieve the pressure that was threatening to dislocate multiple bones simultaneously. "Tyler," Maria said conversationally, maintaining the lock with effortless control while her free hand positioned itself for a strike that would end the confrontation permanently. "If he continued to resist, I want you to pay very close attention to your current situation. The technique I'm applying is called arm drag and shoulder manipulation. If I increase pressure by approximately 10 degrees, your shoulder will dislocate. 20 degrees will tear ligaments that require surgical repair. 30 degrees will cause permanent nerve damage." The entire sequence had taken less than 3 seconds, moving from Tyler's attempted grab to his complete neutralization, so quickly that his companions were still processing the visual information. Chase had been moving forward to support his leader, but stopped mid-step as the tactical situation became clear. Danny's nervous laughter died in his throat as he realized that the balance of power had shifted in ways he didn't understand. Rick's hand moved toward something concealed beneath his jacket, but Uncle Frank grabbed his wrist with surprising speed. The older man's expression reflected recognition of something that the others had missed. They weren't dealing with a frightened teacher anymore, but with someone whose training and mindset belonged in an entirely different category of confrontation. "Don't," Frank said quietly to Rick. "Look at her eyes. Look at how she's positioned. This isn't some amateur who got lucky." Maria maintained her hold on Tyler while assessing the remaining threats with the kind of systematic evaluation that James Mitchell had drilled into her through hundreds of hours of scenario training. Chase was the most immediate concern. Younger, more impulsive, and likely to attack without considering consequences. Danny would follow Chase's lead, but had no independent fighting capability. Rick was the real danger, possessing both experience and probably weapons, but Frank's intervention suggested some level of tactical awareness that might prevent escalation. "Gentlemen," Maria said calmly, her voice steady despite maintaining a joint lock that required precise pressure and positioning. "I want everyone to understand what's happening here. Tyler attempted to assault a faculty member on school property. In the presence of multiple witnesses. The technique I'm using is a standard law enforcement control hold designed to neutralize aggressive behavior without causing permanent injury." She adjusted her grip slightly, causing Tyler to gasp as fresh pain shot through his trapped arm. However, the same technique can cause significant damage if the person being restrained continues to resist, or if his associates attempt to intervene violently. I strongly recommend that everyone remain calm while we discuss how this situation will be resolved. Chase's face was purple with rage and confusion. "You can't do this, you're just a teacher. You can't put your hands on students." "Actually, Chase," Maria replied without taking her eyes off the other men, "faculty members have the right to use reasonable force to protect themselves from assault." Tyler initiated physical contact, with clear intent to intimidate and potentially harm me. My response is both legally justified and professionally appropriate. Danny pulled out his phone, his hands shaking as he started to record. "This is police brutality. You're attacking a student." "Feel free to continue recording, Danny," Maria said. "The video will clearly show Tyler grabbing me before I defend myself. It will also document your group's coordinated harassment campaign and the presence of unauthorized individuals making threats against school personnel." Uncle Frank was studying the situation with the kind of tactical analysis that had kept him alive through decades of high-risk criminal activity. The woman holding his nephew wasn't acting like someone who had stumbled into a lucky defensive move. Her positioning, her calm demeanor under pressure, and her apparent knowledge of legal protocols suggested training and experience that went far beyond basic self-defense classes. "Tyler," Frank said carefully, "stop struggling and listen to what she's saying. This isn't going the way we planned." Rick's scarred face reflected frustration at being denied the violent confrontation he'd been anticipating. "We're not going to let some foreign bitch humiliate the family. There's 5 of us and 1 of her." Maria's smile became genuinely amused. "Actually, Rick, there's 1 trained fighter and 4 people who have never faced someone with military-level combat skills. Those aren't the odds you think they are." The casual confidence with which she mentioned military training made all 4 standing men recalculate their assessment of the situation. Tyler continued to struggle against the joint lock, his pride preventing him from acknowledging defeat, even as the pain intensified with every movement. "Let me go, you crazy bitch," he snarled through gritted teeth. "When I get loose, I'm going to—" Maria increased pressure on the lock, cutting off his threat as agony shot through his shoulder joint. "Tyler, you seem to be confused about your current situation. You're not going to get loose. I'm going to release you when I decide the threat level has been neutralized. Until then, your only choice is whether this ends with you walking away, embarrassed, or being carried away injured." She shifted her stance slightly, the movement appearing casual to untrained observers, but revealing to Frank that she was preparing for multiple attackers while maintaining perfect control of her current captive. The demonstration of tactical competence was unmistakable to anyone who understood violence at a professional level. "Here's what's going to happen," Maria continued, her voice carrying the absolute authority of someone who had taken control of a dangerous situation. "Tyler is going to apologize for his inappropriate behavior and assault. Chase and Danny are going to delete any recordings they've made of our interactions and agree to transfer to different classes. Uncle Frank and Rick are going to leave this building immediately and never return to campus." Chase laughed harshly, but the sound carried nervous uncertainty. And if we don't? What are you going to do? Beat us all up like some action movie? No, Chase, Maria replied calmly. If you don't comply, I'm going to call security, then the police. Then file assault charges against Tyler while requesting restraining orders against all of you. The video evidence will support charges of conspiracy, harassment, and attempted intimidation of school personnel. Given your criminal histories, those charges will result in serious prison time. The mention of their records made all 5 men freeze. They had assumed that a teacher wouldn't have access to background information, but Maria's casual reference to their criminal histories suggested either official knowledge or independent research that indicated much more serious preparation than they had anticipated. Tyler's resistance was weakening as the reality of his situation became clear. The joint lock was expertly applied, causing increasing pain with any movement, while leaving him completely unable to leverage his size advantage. Worse, his companion seemed frozen by the tactical situation, rather than rushing to his aid as they would have in a normal fight. "This isn't over," Tyler gasped, his defiance undermined by the obvious pain in his voice. "You think you won something here, but you have no idea what kind of people you're messing with." Maria's expression became genuinely sympathetic. "Tyler, I know exactly what kind of people I'm dealing with. The question is whether you understand what kind of person you decided to target." She released the joint lock with fluid precision, stepping back to a position that allowed her to observe all 5 men while maintaining access to multiple escape routes. Tyler stumbled forward, clutching his injured shoulder and breathing heavily. As blood flow returned to his trapped arm, the confrontation had reached its critical moment. Tyler's humiliation in front of family members demanded some form of retaliation to preserve his reputation, but the demonstration of Maria's capabilities had fundamentally altered the risk assessment for any continued aggression. The next few seconds would determine whether this ended with grudging retreat or escalated into the kind of violence that would change everything for everyone involved. "Uncle." Frank made the decision that would save his nephew from a beating that could have hospitalized him. "We're leaving," he announced, grabbing Tyler's good arm and pulling him toward the exit. "This situation has gotten out of hand," Rick protested immediately. "Frank, we can't just walk away." The family's reputation," Frank interrupted sharply, "won't be helped by getting our asses kicked by a woman who obviously knows how to fight. Look at her, Rick, really look at her. She's not scared, she's not backing down, and she just controlled Tyler like he was a child. Use your brain." Maria watched the internal conflict play out among the 5 men, understanding that Uncle Frank's tactical awareness was the only thing preventing this from escalating into serious violence. She remained ready for any sudden movements while hoping that cooler heads would prevail over wounded pride and criminal instincts. The moment of truth had arrived, and Maria Santos was about to discover whether her demonstration of strength would be enough to end the harassment or whether she would need to prove that her KRAV MAGA training extended far beyond simple joint locks and defensive positioning. Uncle Frank's attempt to de-escalate the situation crashed into the immovable wall of Tyler Brennan's wounded pride. The humiliation of being controlled so effortlessly by a woman half his size, witnessed by family members whose respect was crucial to his criminal organization's standing, created a psychological crisis that rational thinking couldn't overcome. As Frank pulled him toward the exit, Tyler's injured shoulder reminded him with every step that he had been publicly defeated in front of the people whose opinion mattered most. "No," Tyler said quietly, shaking off his uncle's grip with his good arm. "We're not walking away from this." Rick's scarred face lit up with anticipation. He had been hoping for an excuse to demonstrate the skills that had earned him his reputation in certain circles of Springfield's criminal underworld. The prospect of teaching a lesson to an uppity immigrant teacher who thought she was tough appealed to every violent instinct he possessed. Finally, Rick muttered, reaching into his jacket to retrieve a telescoping baton that extended with a metallic click that echoed through the empty hallway. Time to show this bitch what happens when you disrespect the wrong family. Maria's tactical assessment shifted immediately as the situation escalated from unarmed confrontation to armed assault. The presence of weapons changed every calculation about response levels and legal justifications, while also confirming that these men were prepared to cause serious bodily harm to protect Tyler's damaged ego. Her years of training with James Mitchell had covered exactly this scenario: multiple attackers with weapons in a confined space where escape wasn't possible. Chase and Cove for exactly the scenario: multiple attackers with weapons in a confined space where escape wasn't possible. Danny moved to flank Maria while Tyler flexed his injured shoulder, testing its range of motion despite the obvious pain. The coordination of their positioning revealed that this wasn't spontaneous violence, but practiced pack tactics that they had probably used successfully against other victims. Uncle Frank stepped back toward the exit, his expression reflecting resignation that violence was now inevitable despite his attempts at damage control. "Last chance, Teach," Tyler said, his voice carrying the cold certainty of someone who had crossed the line into serious criminal territory. "You can apologize for putting your hands on me and agree to transfer to a different school, or we can settle this the hard way. Your choice." Maria felt the familiar calm that James Mitchell had trained her to access in life-threatening situations. Her heart rate remained steady while her awareness expanded to take in every detail of the tactical environment: weapon positions, distances between opponents, potential improvised weapons within reach, and the psychological dynamics driving each attacker's behavior. The small classroom behind her offered some maneuvering room, but also potential trap areas where superior numbers could overwhelm her. "Tyler," she said quietly, her accent somehow making her words carry more authority rather than less, "you're about to make the worst mistake of your life. Last warning." Rick laughed harshly, testing the weight of his baton with practiced movements. "The only mistake here was thinking some foreign teacher could come into our community and disrespect American families. Time for your education, bitch." He lunged forward with the baton raised, aiming for Maria's head in a strike designed to end the confrontation immediately through massive trauma. The attack was fast and vicious, drawing on years of street fighting experience and genuine intent to cause permanent injury. Against an untrained opponent, the assault would have been devastating. Maria wasn't untrained. She moved with liquid grace that made the baton whistle harmlessly past her ear as she sidestepped and closed distance in a single fluid motion. Her left hand trapped Rick's weapon arm while her right elbow drove upward toward his chin with surgical precision. The strike connected with a sound like breaking wood as Rick's jaw dislocated, sending him crashing backward into the hallway wall where he slumped unconscious. The baton clattering across the linoleum floor. Chase charged immediately, trying to capitalize on what he assumed was Maria's momentary distraction from neutralizing Rick. His attack was predictable: a bull rush designed to use superior weight to drive her to the ground where his size advantage would become decisive. The tactic had worked against smaller opponents throughout his criminal career, but he had never faced someone with military-level close-quarters combat training. Maria pivoted and redirected Chase's momentum with a hip throw that sent him sailing through the air to crash headfirst into a bank of metal lockers. The impact created a sound like a car accident as Chase's skull met steel, leaving him motionless on the floor with blood pooling beneath his head. The entire sequence from Rick's attack to Chase's neutralization had taken less than 8 seconds. Danny froze in terror as he realized that his companion's superior size and numbers meant nothing against someone who fought with the efficiency of a professional soldier. The nervous energy that usually drove him to follow others into violence disappeared, replaced by the survival instinct of a small predator who suddenly understood he was facing an apex predator. "Danny," Maria said calmly, her breathing barely elevated despite having just defeated 2 armed attackers. You have approximately 5 seconds to decide whether you want to join your friends on the floor or walk away from this situation while you still can. Tyler's face was white with shock and rage as he stared at the crumpled forms of Rick and Chase. His entire worldview was based on the assumption that size and aggression determined the outcome of physical confrontations, but the woman standing in front of him had just demonstrated capabilities that belonged in an entirely different category of violence. "What the hell are you?" he whispered, genuine fear creeping into his voice for the first time since the confrontation began. "I'm someone who survived a war before I was 13 years old," Maria replied quietly. "Someone who spent the last decade learning to make sure I never have to be a victim again. Someone you should have left alone." Uncle Frank had witnessed enough prison violence to recognize professional-level combat skills when he saw them. The way Maria had dismantled Rick and Chase wasn't lucky or accidental. It was the systematic application of training designed to neutralize threats quickly and efficiently. His nephew was about to attack someone who could probably kill all 4 remaining men without breathing hard. "Tyler, stop," Frank said urgently. "This isn't some college girl playing tough. Look at how she moves. Look at what she just did to Rick and Chase. We need to get out of here now." But Tyler's pride had been pushed beyond the breaking point. The humiliation of being controlled by Maria, witnessed by his uncle and cousin, followed by watching her destroy 2 grown men in seconds, created a psychological crisis that could only be resolved through proving his dominance or dying in the attempt. "I don't care if she's some kind of ninja," Tyler snarled, flexing his hands as he prepared for what would likely be the last fight of his criminal career. "Nobody makes me look like a fool in front of my family. Nobody." Danny made his choice, backing away from the confrontation with his hands raised in surrender. "I'm out, Tyler. This is crazy. She's not normal." "Smart choice, Danny," Maria said, her eyes never leaving Tyler as she evaluated his positioning and probable attack patterns. "Tyler, you still have the same option. Walk away, get help for your friends, and never come back to this campus. That's the only way this ends well for you." Tyler's response was a roar of rage as he charged forward with both hands reaching for Maria's throat. His attack was driven by pure emotion rather than tactical thinking, making it predictable but also desperate and potentially more dangerous because of his willingness to accept injury in order to inflict damage. Maria stepped into his charge rather than away from it, slipping inside his reach where his size advantage became a liability. Her knee came up toward his solar plexus while her hands worked to control his arms, but Tyler's desperation made him harder to control than Rick or Chase had been. He absorbed the knee strike and managed to grab Maria's shoulders using his weight to drive her backward toward the classroom wall. For a moment, it seemed like Tyler's size and determination might overcome Maria's technical advantages. His bulk pressed against her as he tried to slam her into the concrete blocks, his face twisted with rage and the satisfaction of finally getting his hands on the woman who had humiliated him. Then Maria demonstrated why. James Mitchell had spent so much time drilling escape techniques for close quarters, grappling situations. Her hands found pressure points on Tyler's neck that sent electric shocks of pain through his nervous system, loosening his grip enough for her to slip to one side. As he stumbled forward off balance, her elbow found the base of his skull in a strike designed to disrupt brain function without causing permanent damage. Tyler's eyes rolled back as his nervous system briefly short-circuited, and he collapsed face first onto the classroom floor. The hallway fell silent except for the sound of Maria's controlled breathing and the distant hum of the building's heating system. 5 men had attempted to intimidate and assault her, and now 4 of them lay unconscious, while the 5th cowered against the wall in terrified surrender. The entire confrontation had lasted less than 3 minutes, but it would be remembered and discussed at Lincoln Valley for years to come. Uncle Frank stared at the carnage in disbelief. Rick and Chase were both unconscious and possibly seriously injured. Tyler was breathing but unresponsive. Danny was pressed against the wall in obvious terror. And the small woman with the Eastern European accent was standing calmly in the middle of it all, barely breathing hard from the exertion of defeating 4 grown men. "Jesus Christ," Frank whispered. "What kind of training do you have?" "The kind that keeps people alive in dangerous situations," Maria replied, pulling out her phone to call for medical assistance and law enforcement. "The kind your nephew should have asked about before he decided to escalate harassment into assault with a deadly weapon." As she dialed 911, Maria reflected on the journey that had brought her from a terrified refugee child to a woman capable of defending herself against multiple armed attackers. The skills James Mitchell had taught her were designed for exactly this type of situation, when de-escalation failed and survival required accessing capabilities that most people hoped they would never need. 911. "What's your emergency?" "This is Maria Santos at Lincoln Valley Adult Learning Institute. I need police and medical assistance. 4 men just attempted to assault me with weapons, and I was forced to defend myself. 2 of the attackers may need immediate medical attention." The operator's voice was professional but concerned. "Are you injured, ma'am? Are the attackers still present?" Maria looked at the unconscious forms of Tyler, Rick, and Chase, then at Danny's terrified face and Uncle Frank's shocked expression. "I'm uninjured. 3 attackers are unconscious and may have serious injuries. 2 others are present, but no longer pose a threat. I'll remain on the scene until officers arrive." As she provided additional details to the emergency operator, Maria understood that this confrontation represented more than just self-defense against workplace harassment. Tyler Brennan and his crew had chosen to escalate their intimidation campaign into serious criminal territory, and their defeat would send a message throughout Springfield's criminal community that immigrant teachers weren't necessarily easy targets. The sound of approaching sirens in the distance marked the end of one phase of Maria Santos' journey and the beginning of another. She had proven that 10 years of KRAV MAGA training could overcome superior numbers and weapons when applied with tactical intelligence and unshakable determination. Now she would need to navigate the legal and social consequences of being a woman who had successfully defended herself against the kind of men who were accustomed to getting their way through violence and intimidation. But as she looked at the evidence of her victory scattered across the hallway floor, Maria felt a deep sense of satisfaction that went beyond mere physical triumph. She had stood her ground, protected her dignity, and demonstrated that accent discrimination would not be tolerated when it escalated into criminal behavior. Tyler Brennan had learned the hard way that his biggest mistake wasn't underestimating a teacher. It was choosing the wrong survivor to corner. The first Springfield police cruiser arrived at Lincoln Valley Adult Learning Institute within 7 minutes of Maria's 911 call, followed quickly by 2 ambulances and a fire department rescue unit. The flashing lights created a kaleidoscope of red and blue across the industrial landscape as emergency responders flooded into the building to assess what the dispatcher had described as a multiple assault situation with serious injuries. Detective Lieutenant Sarah Crawford was the supervising officer who took control of the scene. A 20-year veteran of the Springfield Police Department with extensive experience in violent crime investigation, Crawford had seen enough domestic violence, bar fights, and gang conflicts to recognize when something didn't fit the typical patterns. The initial report of a female teacher defending herself against 4 male attackers with weapons raised immediate questions about the circumstances and the participants involved. Maria remained exactly where she had been when the confrontation ended, standing calmly near the emergency exit of her classroom while maintaining visual contact with Uncle Frank and Danny. Her professional demeanor and obvious lack of injury contrasted sharply with the chaos of unconscious men scattered across The hallway and the urgent activity of paramedics working to stabilize the wounded. Ms. Santos? Detective Crawford approached with the careful positioning of someone accustomed to potentially dangerous situations. I'm Lieutenant Crawford. Are you injured? Do you need medical attention? I'm uninjured, Maria replied clearly, her slight accent somehow making her words seem more precise rather than less. However, I believe at least 2 of the attackers may have serious head injuries and require immediate medical care. I used necessary force to defend myself, but I'm concerned about their condition. Crawford studied Maria's appearance carefully. Her clothing was slightly disheveled, but showed no signs of the kind of damage typically associated with violent struggles. Her breathing was normal, her hands were steady, and her demeanor suggested someone who had been through a stressful situation, but remained in complete control of her emotional and physical responses. Can you walk me through what happened? Here? Crawford asked, pulling out a digital recorder and notepad. Start from the beginning and take your time. As Maria provided her initial statement, paramedics worked frantically on Rick and Chase. Rick's jaw was clearly dislocated and possibly fractured, while Chase had sustained what appeared to be a severe concussion from his impact with the lockers. Tyler was semi-conscious but responsive to verbal commands, though he seemed confused about his location and recent events. The severity of their injuries stood in stark contrast to Maria's obvious lack of harm. These 3 men, Maria explained, indicating Tyler, Chase, and Danny, have been conducting a systematic harassment campaign against me for approximately 6 weeks. The harassment focused primarily on mocking my accent and questioning my qualifications to teach English to American students. This morning, they brought 2 additional men, Tyler's uncle Frank and his cousin Rick, to escalate the intimidation. Crawford took detailed notes while observing the crime scene. The telescoping baton that Rick had used lay near the lockers where Chase had been thrown, providing physical evidence of weapons involvement. The positioning of the unconscious men suggested a fight that had moved rapidly through the hallway, with each attacker being neutralized in a different location. Uncle Frank, who had been standing quietly against the wall since the police arrived, suddenly found himself the focus of official attention as additional officers arrived to secure the scene and interview witnesses. Sir, I need to see some identification, Officer Martinez requested firmly. Are you injured? Do you require medical attention? Frank's criminal background made him instinctively wary of police contact, but the circumstances left him little choice but to cooperate. Frank Brennan, he said reluctantly, producing a driver's license. Tyler's my nephew. I came here this morning to discuss his education with his teacher. Officer Martinez ran Frank's information through the department's database, revealing an extensive criminal history, including multiple assault convictions, weapons charges, and suspected involvement in organized criminal enterprises. The discovery that Maria had been confronted by known violent criminals, rather than simply disgruntled students, significantly altered the department's assessment of the situation. Danny Rodriguez provided a very different perspective during his separate interview with Detective Crawford. His nervous energy had transformed into obvious terror as he realized that he was now facing serious criminal charges in addition to having witnessed violence that exceeded anything in his previous experience. Look, I didn't want any part of this, Danny said, his hands shaking as he spoke. Tyler said we were just going to scare her, make her understand that she needed to show more respect. Nobody said anything about weapons or really hurting anybody. Crawford pressed for details about the systematic harassment campaign, uncovering a pattern of behavior that went far beyond typical classroom disruption. Danny's account revealed weeks of coordinated psychological warfare designed to force Maria to quit her position or transfer to a different institution. Tyler said his uncle had connections, political connections, business connections, Danny continued. He said they could get her fired if she didn't start treating American students with proper respect. The whole thing with bringing Frank in Rick was supposed to show her that she was outnumbered and outgunned. The investigation took on additional complexity when security footage from the building's limited camera system became available. While the hallway confrontation itself had occurred in a blind spot between cameras, footage from other areas documented the systematic reconnaissance that Tyler's group had been conducting for several days prior to the assault. These men were clearly planning something, Detective Crawford observed as she reviewed the footage with the building's security coordinator. They tested door locks, timed security rounds, and mapped areas with limited visibility. This wasn't spontaneous violence, it was premeditated assault. Principal Margaret Foster arrived at the scene 2 hours after the initial emergency call, having been contacted by the district administration as news of the incident spread through official channels. Her reaction to the situation revealed the institutional failures that had allowed the harassment to escalate to criminal violence. "I had no idea the situation was this serious," Foster told Detective Crawford during her interview. Ms. Santos reported some classroom disruption, but she never indicated that she was in physical danger or that the students were conducting organized intimidation. Crawford's review of the documentation that Maria had submitted to the administration painted a very different picture. The reports clearly described escalating harassment concerning psychological and potentially criminal elements, yet the institutional response had been to pressure Maria to accommodate the problematic behavior rather than address it directly. Ms. Foster, these reports describe systematic harassment based on national origin, implied threats about political and business connections, and increasingly aggressive behavior from known violent criminals, Crawford observed. "What specific actions did your administration take to address these documented concerns?" Foster's uncomfortable answers revealed an institutional culture that prioritized enrollment numbers and avoided controversy over protecting faculty and students from criminal behavior. The administration's failure to respond appropriately to Maria's reports had effectively enabled Tyler's group to escalate their intimidation campaign until violence became inevitable. Meanwhile, Sergeant James Mitchell arrived at the hospital where Rick and Chase had been transported for emergency treatment. As Maria's KRAV MAGA instructor and a retired Special Forces soldier, he possessed expertise in combat injuries that could help medical personnel understand the nature of the trauma they were treating. The jaw dislocation was caused by a precision elbow strike, Mitchell explained to the emergency room physician treating Rick. Clean technique, controlled force, designed to neutralize without causing permanent damage. The patient should recover fully with proper treatment. Chase's condition was more serious, but still within acceptable parameters for defensive force. Concussion from impact with a hard surface, Mitchell assessed. Probably the result of a hip throw or similar redirection technique. Again, controlled application of force designed to stop an attack rather than cause maximum damage. Tyler's injuries were the least severe, consisting primarily of temporary nervous system disruption from pressure point strikes. He'll be disoriented for a few hours, but there shouldn't be any lasting effects, Mitchell told the attending physician. These are textbook defensive techniques, exactly what you'd expect from someone with proper training using appropriate force against multiple attackers. The medical assessment supported Maria's account of the confrontation and demonstrated that her response had been measured and professional despite the extreme circumstances. Rather than causing excessive damage to her attackers, she had used precisely the amount of force necessary to neutralize each threat and prevent further violence. Detective Crawford's investigation also uncovered evidence of Tyler's group's criminal activities beyond the harassment of Maria. Database searches revealed connections to several unsolved assault cases, drug trafficking operations, and intimidation campaigns against other victims who had been too frightened to press charges. This wasn't an isolated incident, Crawford explained to the district attorney's office during a briefing on potential charges. These men have been using the same tactics against multiple victims throughout the community, Miss Santos was simply the first person with the training and courage to fight back effectively. The legal implications of the case extended beyond simple assault charges. The systematic nature of the harassment campaign, the involvement of weapons, and the coordination among multiple participants supported charges of conspiracy, criminal intimidation, and assault with deadly weapons. Tyler's extensive criminal record made him eligible for enhanced sentencing under habitual offender statutes. As news of the confrontation spread through Springfield's criminal community, the reaction was mixed between respect for Maria's capabilities and concern about the implications for other intimidation operations. Word that a small immigrant teacher had defeated 4 men, including known enforcers like Rick and Chase, challenged fundamental assumptions about power dynamics in criminal enterprises. "She's not just some lucky amateur," reported one of Frank Brennan's associates who had reviewed the security footage. "That was professional-level violence. Military training, probably special operations background." Tyler picked the wrong target for his demonstration. The incident also attracted attention from immigrant rights organizations and educational advocacy groups. Maria's successful defense against ethnically motivated harassment represented a significant victory for communities that had long struggled with discrimination and intimidation without adequate institutional protection. Dr. Elena Vasquez, director of the Springfield Immigrant Resource Center, contacted Maria within hours of the incident becoming public. "What you did today sends a message to every immigrant in this community," she told Maria during their phone conversation. "You prove that we don't have to accept harassment and intimidation as the price of building lives in America." However, the victory came with concerning implications for Maria's future safety and career prospects. Tyler's family connections to organized criminal enterprises meant that retaliation remained a possibility, despite the legal consequences they were facing. The institutional failure at Lincoln Valley also raised questions about whether the educational environment could be made safe for faculty who refused to tolerate discriminatory behavior. As the initial investigation concluded and formal charges were filed against Tyler's group, Maria found herself at the center of a larger conversation about workplace safety, institutional responsibility, and the rights of immigrants to pursue careers without facing ethnically motivated harassment. Her successful defense had transformed a personal confrontation into a community-wide examination of how society protects vulnerable populations from systematic intimidation. The immediate crisis was over, but the long-term implications of Maria Santos' refusal to be victimized were just beginning to unfold throughout Springfield and beyond. 6 months after the confrontation that would forever change Lincoln Valley Adult Learning Institute, Maria Santos stood before a packed auditorium at Springfield Community College, addressing the graduating class of the first ever Immigrant Empowerment and Safety Program. The initiative, born from the aftermath of her encounter with Tyler Brennan's crew, had grown from a single woman's refusal to be intimidated into a comprehensive educational movement that was being replicated across Missouri and neighboring states. The program combined practical self-defense training with legal education, professional development, and psychological support for immigrants facing workplace harassment and discrimination. What made it unique was its integration of language learning with empowerment skills, recognizing that confidence in personal safety directly correlated with academic and professional success for marginalized populations. "When I first arrived in Springfield," Maria told the diverse audience of graduates, their families, and community leaders, "I believed that education alone would protect me from prejudice and discrimination. I learned that knowledge must sometimes be paired with the ability to defend yourself and others when institutional systems fail to provide adequate protection." The graduates represented 15 different countries and spoke 11 languages, but they shared common experiences of having faced harassment, intimidation, or discrimination based on their accents, backgrounds, or immigration status. The 12-week program had taught them not only practical self-defense techniques, but also legal rights, documentation strategies, and community organizing skills that empowered them to stand up for themselves and others. Tyler Brennan was serving a 4-year sentence in Missouri State Penitentiary, having pleaded guilty to conspiracy, assault with a deadly weapon, and criminal intimidation charges. His plea agreement had avoided a trial that could have resulted in much longer sentences under habitual offender laws, but the prison term effectively ended his role as a community intimidator. More importantly, his public defeat at the hands of a woman he had underestimated had destroyed his reputation among criminal associates. Rick Martinez had served 18 months for assault charges and violations of his parole conditions. Upon release, he had relocated to another state rather than face the humiliation of remaining in a community where his defeat was widely known. The jaw injuries he sustained in the confrontation had required extensive surgery, leaving him with permanent speech difficulties that served as a daily reminder of the consequences of underestimating potential victims. Chase Morrison's concussion had resulted in lasting cognitive effects that ended his effectiveness as an enforcer for local criminal enterprises. Unable to maintain the quick reflexes and situational awareness that his violent lifestyle required, he had been forced to seek legitimate employment for the first time in his adult life. The brain injury that Maria's defensive actions had caused became an inadvertent rehabilitation that redirected his life away from criminal activity. Uncle Frank Brennan had avoided prison time by cooperating fully with law enforcement investigations into his family's criminal enterprises. His cooperation had led to indictments against several other members of their organization and had effectively ended their operation in the Springfield area. However, his reputation as someone who had backed down from a confrontation with a female teacher had made him a liability in criminal circles, forcing him into early retirement from illegal activities. Danny Rodriguez had completed a court-mandated rehabilitation program and was now enrolled in legitimate educational courses at Lincoln Valley, which had been completely restructured following the incident. His transformation from nervous follower to motivated student demonstrated the potential for positive change when toxic leadership influences were removed from educational environments. The institutional changes at Lincoln Valley Adult Learning Institute had been dramatic and comprehensive. Principal Margaret Foster had been removed from her position, following a district investigation that revealed systemic failures in protecting faculty and students from harassment and criminal activity. The new administration, led by Dr. Carmen Rodriguez, a former immigration attorney with extensive experience in civil rights advocacy, had implemented policies that prioritize safety and respect over enrollment numbers. Zero tolerance for harassment based on national origin, accent, or immigration status. Dr. Rodriguez explained during a faculty meeting 6 months after the incident. We will not sacrifice the safety and dignity of our community members to avoid difficult conversations or potential enrollment losses. Education works best in environments where everyone feels respected and protected. The restructured Lincoln Valley now served as a model for other adult education institutions facing similar challenges with harassment and discrimination. The campus had implemented comprehensive safety protocols, hired security personnel with appropriate training for dealing with criminal behavior, and established partnerships with law enforcement agencies that ensured rapid response to threatening situations. Maria's role had evolved far beyond traditional teaching responsibilities. As Director of Student Safety and Empowerment, she oversaw programs that combined academic instruction with practical life skills for vulnerable populations. Her background as both an immigrant success story and someone with proven defensive capabilities made her uniquely qualified to understand and address the complex challenges facing adult learners from marginalized communities. The legal precedent established by Maria's case had implications that extended throughout Missouri's educational system. The successful prosecution of Tyler's group under conspiracy and weapons charges, demonstrated that systematic harassment campaigns against faculty could result in serious criminal penalties. Educational institutions across the state began reviewing their policies for reporting and responding to harassment, recognizing that ignoring such behavior could expose them to both legal liability and public criticism. Attorney Sarah Mitchell, who had represented Maria throughout the legal proceedings, observed that the case had fundamentally changed how courts viewed harassment of immigrant educators. The systematic nature of the campaign, combined with the escalation to weapons and family involvement, established clear precedent that accent-based discrimination can constitute criminal behavior when it creates hostile environments. The community impact of Maria's successful defense extended far beyond the immediate participants. Springfield's immigrant communities, which had long struggled with discrimination and intimidation without adequate recourse, found new confidence in reporting harassment and seeking institutional protection. The knowledge that someone had successfully fought back against organized intimidation encouraged others to stand up for their rights rather than simply enduring abuse. James Mitchell continued to serve as lead instructor for the self-defense components of Maria's programs, but his role had expanded to include training law enforcement officers in recognizing and responding to harassment campaigns against immigrant communities. His military background and expertise in tactical assessment provided credibility with police departments that had previously been reluctant to take immigrant complaints seriously. What Maria accomplished wasn't just personal self-defense, Mitchell explained during a training session for Springfield police officers. She demonstrated that proper preparation and training can overcome significant disadvantages in numbers and size. More importantly, she showed that immigrant communities don't have to accept intimidation as the price of building lives in America. The ripple effects of the incident reached into Springfield's business community as well. Several companies that had previously overlooked harassment of immigrant employees began implementing more robust policies and training programs. The high-profile nature of Maria's case, combined with the serious criminal charges that resulted from workplace intimidation, made business leaders aware that tolerating such behavior could expose them to significant legal and financial consequences. Dr. Elena Vasquez from the Springfield Immigrant Resource Center had documented a 300% increase in requests for legal assistance and advocacy services in the months following Maria's confrontation with Tyler's group. People who had been suffering in silence for years suddenly realized that they had rights and resources available to help them. Maria's example gave them permission to demand better treatment. The educational innovations that emerged from Maria's programs began attracting attention from universities and policy institutes studying immigrant integration and empowerment. Her approach of combining language learning with safety training, legal education, and professional development created a holistic model that addressed multiple barriers to immigrant success simultaneously. Professor David Chun from the University of Missouri's Education Policy Institute conducted a comprehensive study of Maria's programs and their outcomes. The integration of empowerment training with traditional academic instruction produces measurably better results in terms of graduation rates, employment outcomes, and community engagement, his research concluded. Students who feel safe and confident in their ability to protect themselves and their rights demonstrate significantly higher academic achievement and professional advancement. The success of Maria's programs had also attracted federal attention, with the Department of Education providing grants to expand the model to other states with large immigrant populations. The recognition that educational success for vulnerable populations required addressing safety and empowerment issues beyond traditional academic instruction represented a significant shift in federal education policy. However, the transformation wasn't without ongoing challenges. Maria continued to receive occasional threats from associates of Tyler's criminal organization, requiring ongoing security measures and vigilance. The high profile of her success had made her a target for individuals who viewed her empowerment programs as threatening to established power structures that benefited from immigrant vulnerability. The hardest part isn't the physical confrontations, Maria reflected during an interview with a national education magazine. It's the constant awareness that success in challenging systemic discrimination makes you a target for people who profit from maintaining those systems. But the alternative, accepting intimidation and limiting our potential, isn't acceptable either. The personal cost of becoming a public figure in immigrant rights advocacy had required significant adjustments in Maria's life. She had moved to a more secure apartment, modified her daily routines to reduce predictability, and maintained the intensive training regimen that had enabled her to survive the original confrontation. The woman who had simply wanted to teach English had become a symbol of resistance against discrimination, with all the responsibilities and risks that such symbolism entailed. Yet the rewards of her transformation were evident in every graduation ceremony, every successful student who found better employment, and every immigrant who reported harassment rather than suffering in silence. The classroom where Tyler Brennan had attempted to assert dominance through intimidation had become the birthplace of a movement that was changing how America's educational institutions serve their most vulnerable populations. As Maria looked out at the graduating class of the Immigrant Empowerment and Safety Program, she saw faces that reflected her own journey from vulnerable refugee to confident advocate. The students had learned not only defensive techniques and legal rights, but also the fundamental lesson that strength comes not from the absence of fear, but from the refusal to let fear determine your response to injustice. Your accents are not weaknesses to be hidden, Maria told the graduates as their families applauded in multiple languages. They are evidence of the courage it took to build new lives in a challenging environment. Your backgrounds are not barriers to success. They are assets that bring unique perspectives and capabilities to your communities. And your right to be treated with dignity and respect is not negotiable, regardless of who might attempt to intimidate you into believing otherwise. The ceremony concluded with presentations of certificates, but the real graduation had occurred months earlier, when each student made the decision to transform from potential victim into empowered community member. Tyler Brennan's attempt to silence one immigrant teacher through harassment and intimidation had inadvertently created an army of advocates who would ensure that such campaigns became increasingly difficult and costly for future perpetrators. As the crowd dispersed and families celebrated their loved ones' achievements, Maria Santos reflected on the journey that had brought her from a broken coffee mug in an empty classroom to a national platform for immigrant empowerment. The confrontation that had begun with mockery of her accent had ended with the creation of programs that celebrated linguistic diversity as a community asset rather than a target for discrimination. The legend of Maria Santos was no longer just about a teacher who fought back against bullies. It has evolved into something more powerful, proof that individuals who refuse to accept injustice can create changes that extend far beyond their personal circumstances, transforming not only their own lives, but the lives of countless others who follow in their footsteps. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.